The scent of lemon oil and old wood was the only thing that felt real. It was the scent of her labor, the tangible result of her hands moving over priceless antiques in a house that was more museum than home. Noelle moved with a practiced economy, her steps silent on the polished floors. In this world of quiet, lethal men, silence was a currency she had learned to mint herself. She was a ghost in a dark blue uniform, her presence meant to be felt only in the gleam of a surface, the absence of a speck of dust. Today, the silence was different. It was heavier, centered in the main living area, a vast space of glass and steel overlooking a meticulously raked Zen garden. He was there, Takashi Ito. She saw him from the hallway, a long, elegant shape sprawled on the low-slung leather sofa. He was supposed to be in Osaka. Her schedule, provided by the severe head housekeeper, was clear. The master was away until Friday. Today was Wednesday. Her first instinct was a quiet retreat. His presence disrupted the sterile peace of her routine. But her cleaning cart was still in the corner of the room, her duties unfinished. To leave would be noticed. To stay felt like an intrusion. She hesitated, her hand resting on the cool metal of the cart. That is when she made the mistake of looking closer. He was sleeping or pretending to be. One arm was draped over his eyes, but it did not look like a posture of rest. It was a guard. He was dressed in a suit of charcoal wool so finely tailored it seemed a part of him, even in repose. The jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a sliver of a crisp white shirt. At his wrist, the subtle glint of a Patek Philippe watch. At his throat, just above the starched collar, the inky blue-black tail of a dragon tattoo curled against his skin. It was the only part of him that seemed untamed. And on the low table before him, chaos. Stacks of yen, bound in paper bands, sat in untidy piles. It was a fortune. Enough to change a life. Enough to end one. It was a test. The thought landed in her mind with cold certainty. The sudden return, the feigned sleep, the vulgar display of cash. It was all a performance, and she was the unwitting audience. Her heart, usually a steady, reliable drum, picked up its tempo. She had worked for Mr. Ito for 6 months. In that time, she had learned the rules. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Do not exist beyond your function. She had followed them perfectly. She was invisible, reliable, safe. This test felt like a violation of that unspoken contract. He was trying to see her, to find a flaw in the perfect, polished surface she presented. She could leave the room, pretend she had not seen him, finish her work elsewhere and return later. That would be the safe choice. Or she could clean the room, as scheduled, and ignore both him and the money. That would be the professional choice. It would show she was unflappable, uninterested. Her eyes moved from the money to his face. The arm over his eyes had shifted slightly. She could see the faint tension in his jaw, the hard line of his mouth. He was not at peace. The air around him was thick with a weariness that went deeper than a lack of sleep. It was a bone-deep exhaustion she recognized, not from men like him, but from the nurses and doctors she'd seen during her mother's long illness. The look of people fighting a war on too many fronts. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed her cart into the room. The soft whir of the wheels was the only sound. She did not look at the money. She did not look at him. She began to dust the bookshelves that lined the far wall, her movements fluid and unhurried. She could feel his stillness, a predatory focus that belied the pretense of sleep. Every fiber of her being was aware of him. The weight of his silence was a physical pressure against her skin. She worked her way around the room, saving the area around the sofa for last. When she could avoid it no longer, she approached the low table. She polished its surface, her cloth moving carefully around the stacks of cash, as if they were nothing more than decorative objects. She did not allow her fingers to brush a single bill. She treated the fortune with the same detached respect she gave the priceless ceramics on the mantelpiece. Her work was done. The room was immaculate. She should leave. But she paused. The air conditioning was set to its usual Arctic temperature, a preference of his she had learned early on. He was in his suit, but sleep lowered the body's temperature. A faint, almost imperceptible shiver ran through his frame. It was so small she might have imagined it. But she had not. In the linen closet down the hall was a cashmere throw, the color of smoke. It was impossibly soft, reserved for guests. She had folded it just this morning. Without allowing herself to think, to second-guess the impulse, she turned and left the room. Her steps were still silent. She returned moments later with the blanket. She walked to the sofa. She could smell his cologne now, a subtle, clean scent of cedar, and something else she could not name, something like cold night air. She stood over him for a single, breath-held moment. His breathing was too even, too controlled. He was absolutely awake. He knew she was there. He was waiting to see what she would do. Her hands did not tremble as she unfolded the blanket. With a grace she did not know she possessed, she gently draped it over him, from his shoulders to his expensive shoes. The soft cashmere settled over his powerful frame. She made sure it covered the hand with the watch, tucking it in slightly at his side. It was a simple gesture, a human gesture. It was not the act of a maid to her master. It was the act of one person seeing another's fatigue and offering a small, anonymous comfort. She did not look at his face. She turned, collected her cart, and walked out of the room, the silence closing in behind her. As the door clicked softly shut, Takashi Ito moved the arm from his eyes. He looked down at the cashmere blanket covering him, his long fingers tracing the edge. He had been testing her. He tested everyone. Loyalty in his world was a commodity, bought with fear or greed. He had expected her to fail.
He had wanted her to.
A simple theft would have been easy to deal with. It was a language he understood. This, however, this quiet act of care, it was a language he had long forgotten. He stared at the closed door, his mind replaying the gentle weight of the blanket settling over him. He had felt the warmth of her hands through the fabric, a fleeting touch that had somehow breached defenses built over a lifetime of violence and betrayal.
Noelle.
He said her name in his mind. It sounded different now. For the first time since she had started working in his house, he truly saw her. And what he saw left him utterly, dangerously speechless. The next morning, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Sato, intercepted Noelle by the kitchens. The older woman's face, usually a mask of stern neutrality, was tight with something that looked like concern. "Mr. Ito has requested you serve his tea this morning," she said, her voice low. In his office. Noelle's hands stilled on the apron she was tying. "Me? I don't serve." "Today you do," Mrs. Sato replied, her eyes flicking down the hall as if expecting him to appear. The usual girl called in sick. Noelle knew it was a lie. Hanako was never sick. This was not a coincidence. This was a summons. The blanket had been a message sent, and this was the reply. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Takashi's office was on the top floor, a stark, minimalist space with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of Tokyo. He was not looking at the view. He was standing before a long, low credenza, his back to the door. When she entered with the tray, he did not turn. "Set it on the desk," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and cold as river stone. She did as she was told, her movements precise. She arranged the porcelain cup and pot, the small dish of sweets. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. She was supposed to leave. Her job was done. But she felt rooted to the spot, held there by his stillness. He turned, and for the first time, she allowed herself to look at him directly. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and unnervingly perceptive. They took in everything. He was wearing a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dense, intricate artwork of his tattoos. They were not just the tail of a dragon, but a full mural of scales and claws and fire that covered his skin. He moved like the room owed him space. "You are not afraid of the money," he stated. It was not a question. "It was not mine to be afraid of," Noelle answered, her voice even. A flicker of something, surprise? Interest, passed through his eyes. "Everything in this house is mine. That does not stop people from wanting it." Wanting and taking are two different things, sir. He walked toward the desk, stopping on the other side. He was close enough now that she could see the single, faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. It was an imperfection that only highlighted the severe perfection of his other features. "And the blanket?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Was that yours to give?" She held his gaze. This was the real test, not the money.
This.
"I saw a person who looked cold," she said simply. "I offered what comfort I could." He was silent for a long moment, studying her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every layer of her composure being peeled back and analyzed. He was looking for the angle, the motive. In his world, there was always an angle. An act of kindness was just a debt in disguise. "The last person who offered me comfort," he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it, "did so because she wanted something. She wanted me to spare her brother's life." He picked up the teacup, his fingers long and sure around the delicate porcelain. "I did not." The confession hung in the air between them, brutal and cold. It was a warning. It was a glimpse into the abyss that separated his world from hers. He was telling her who he was, showing her the blood on his hands. He was giving her a reason to be afraid.
Noelle's throat was dry.
She should have been terrified. A part of her was. But another, stronger part felt a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. The way he spoke of it, with a flat, dead finality, spoke of a wound, a shame he carried. She could have left then. She could have walked out of that office, out of that house, and never looked back. Mrs. Sato would have understood. Any sane person would have run. But as she looked at him, at the predator in the bespoke suit, she saw the exhausted man on the sofa again. She saw the scar and the carefully controlled pain in his eyes. And she made a choice. "I am not her," Noelle said, her voice quiet but firm. "And I want nothing from you." She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect her position required, and turned to leave. His voice stopped her at the door. "Noelle." He said her name differently than anyone else had. It was not the crisp, formal tone of Mrs. Sato or the hurried murmur of the other staff. He said it as if he were testing the shape of it on his tongue. She turned back. "You'll serve my tea every morning from now on," he said. It was an order absolute. And as she walked away, she knew that the invisible walls she had so carefully constructed around herself had begun to crumble. She had stepped out of the shadows, and Takashi Ito had seen her. That was the moment everything changed. The days that followed settled into a new, tense rhythm. Every morning at 7, Noelle would bring his tea. Sometimes he was at his desk, immersed in paperwork. Other times, he would be standing at the window, a solitary figure against the sprawling city. He rarely spoke more than a few words to her, but his eyes followed her every move. The office became a crucible where the space between them crackled with unspoken things. She learned him in fragments. The way he held his pen, a tight, controlled grip. The way a muscle in his jaw would tick when he was on a difficult phone call. She saw him meet with dangerous men, men whose suits could not conceal the hardness in their eyes or the bulges beneath their jackets. During these meetings, she would serve tea and then disappear, but she learned to read the temperature of the room. She learned the difference between a tense negotiation and the prelude to violence. One afternoon, she was cleaning the study when she noticed a small, framed photograph on a side table, partially obscured by a stack of books. It was the only personal item in the entire minimalist mansion. Curiosity overriding her caution, she picked it up. It was a picture of a younger Takashi, perhaps in his late teens, with his arm around a smiling young woman with the same dark, intelligent eyes. A sister. There was a lightness in his expression she had never seen, a genuine, unguarded joy. The door opened. "What are you doing?" His voice was ice. Noelle froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She turned slowly, the photograph still in her hands. He stood in the doorway, his face a thunderous mask. She had never seen him angry before. She had seen him cold, calculating, lethal. But this was different. This was raw. I was dusting," she stammered, her composure shattering. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence overwhelming. He did not snatch the frame from her, but held out his hand, his eyes never leaving hers. His gaze was burning, accusatory. She had crossed a line. She had touched his wound. Her hands trembled as she placed the photograph in his palm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He stared down at the picture, his thumb gently brushing over the girl's smiling face. The anger in him seemed to recede, replaced by a profound and suffocating sadness. "Her name was Hannah," he said, his voice rough. "She was my sister." He did not elaborate. He did not have to. Noel understood. This was the woman he had failed to protect. The ghost that haunted this silent, perfect house. The source of the shame he carried. "She paid the price for my choices," he continued, speaking more to the photograph than to her. "They used her to get to me. I was too slow, too arrogant." He looked up at Noel then, and his eyes were hollow. He was letting her see past the armor, showing her the rot and ruin beneath the empire he commanded. He was showing her the cost. In that moment, she was no longer his maid. He was no longer her employer. They were just 2 people in a quiet room with a ghost. Her hand, acting of its own accord, lifted and gently touched his forearm, over the inked skin of the dragon. "I am sorry for your loss," she said softly. His entire body went rigid at her touch. His gaze dropped to her hand on his arm. It was a simple, comforting gesture, but in their world, it was an earthquake. He looked back up at her, his expression unreadable, a storm of emotions warring behind his eyes. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of his past and the uncertainty of their future. He did not pull away. That night, the war came to their door. Noel was jolted from a light sleep by the sound of shattering glass from the floor below. It was followed by a series of muffled, ugly thuds. Her heart leaped into her throat. She threw on her robe, her mind racing. An earthquake? A robbery? Then she heard a gunshot. A single, sharp crack that echoed through the house. There was no question now. This was an attack. This was his world, crashing into the sanitized quiet of the mansion. Her first instinct was to hide, to lock her door and pray. But a different, stronger impulse took over. Takashi. She crept out of her room, her bare feet silent on the cold hallway floor. The house was dark, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows. She could hear movement downstairs, heavy footsteps, a low voice barking orders in a dialect she didn't recognize. They weren't his men. She had to get out. She had to warn someone. But as she neared the top of the grand staircase, she saw them. 2 men, dressed in black, dragging a wounded guard out of sight. One of them looked up, his eyes scanning the upper floor. Noelle flattened herself against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind, another arm snaking around her waist, pulling her back into the shadows of a darkened alcove. She tried to scream, to struggle, but the arm was like a band of steel. "Quiet," a voice hissed in her ear. It was him. The warmth of his body was a shocking contrast to the cold fear icing her veins. He was pressed against her back, his chest solid and unyielding. He smelled of cedar and gunpowder. He held her there, both of them motionless, as the men downstairs continued their search. She could feel the steady, calm beat of his heart against her spine. He was not afraid. He was born for this. "They're from the Kanmatsu clan," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "They're here for me." He slowly released her, his hand falling from her mouth. He held a finger to his own lips, then pointed down a service corridor she used daily. The escape route. He was giving her a way out. She could run, disappear into the Tokyo night, and never look back. She looked at his face in the dim light. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his temple. His eyes were dark and focused, all business. He was a general in the middle of a battle, and he was trying to save her. She thought of the photograph, of his sister, Hannah. He had been too slow then. He would not be too slow now. But she was not Hannah. She would not be a weakness. She would not be a ghost he had to carry. She shook her head. A look of disbelief crossed his face. He grabbed her arm, his grip urgent. "Go, Noelle."
Now.
"No," she whispered back, her voice shaking but resolute. "This is my home, too." She had crossed a line she could not uncross. She was no longer an employee. She was a participant. His eyes searched hers in the darkness, and in them, she saw a flicker of something that was not command, not control, but a raw, stunning vulnerability. He had expected her to run.
He had wanted her to.
Her refusal was a complication he could not afford and a validation he did not know he needed. "The server room," she breathed, her mind working furiously. "There's a reinforced door. And a separate phone line. She knew the layout of this house better than anyone. It was her domain." He stared at her for a second longer, a silent, lightning-fast calculation happening behind his eyes. He nodded once. It was an acceptance.
En alliance.
He moved first, a shadow in the darkness. She followed, her fear now a sharp, focused energy. They slipped down the corridor, the sounds of the invasion growing fainter behind them. He moved through the violence like it was choreography, his competence a form of intimacy she was not prepared for. Just as they reached the door to the server room, one of the intruders appeared at the end of the hall. He raised his weapon. There was no time to think. Noelle shoved a heavy linen cart that stood against the wall directly into his path. It was a clumsy, desperate move, but it worked. The man stumbled, his shot going wide, shattering a vase. The sound gave them away. Footsteps thundered toward them. Takashi shoved her into the server room, following right behind her and slamming the heavy steel door shut. He threw the deadbolt, the sound echoing like a cannon in the small, cold space. They were safe for now.
Trapped.
The room was filled with the low hum of the servers, their blinking green lights casting an eerie glow on their faces. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. He leaned against the door, breathing heavily, his eyes closed for a moment. The cut on his temple was bleeding more freely now. Without a word, she ripped a strip of fabric from the hem of her robe and gently dabbed at the wound. He flinched at her touch, but did not pull away. He opened his eyes and looked at her. They were inches apart, the air thick with the aftermath of violence and the scent of his blood. "You should have run," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You told me once that wanting and taking are two different things," she replied, her fingers steady as she cleaned the cut. "I think staying and running are, too." He reached up and caught her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. His touch was electric. "You are the only person in this house who does not look at me with fear," he said, his voice raw with a dangerous honesty.
"Why?"
She looked into his dark eyes, the cold, hard mask of the Yakuza boss stripped away, leaving only the man. "Because I don't think you're the monster you want everyone to believe you are." "You're wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I am.
But when you look at me."
For a moment, I forget. That was the confession. Not of love, but of something far more potent. An admission of the humanity she alone seemed able to find in him. He leaned in, and she thought he was going to kiss her. But he stopped, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing again. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, two worlds colliding in the humming darkness of a besieged server room. The enemy was at the door, but in that moment, the only war that mattered was the one that had just ended between them. The Kenmatsu clan did not give up easily. They spent an hour trying to breach the server room door before the sirens began to wail in the distance. Takashi's men had arrived. The assault was over as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a trail of broken furniture, shattered glass, and the metallic scent of blood. In the aftermath, the mansion was transformed. His soldiers, silent men in dark suits, moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, cleaning up the mess, assessing the damage. Noelle felt like a stranger in a place she had once known so intimately. The boundary between her world and his had been irrevocably erased. Takashi took her to his office, the only room untouched by the violence. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to her. Her hand was surprisingly steady as she took it. "They know who you are now," he said, his back to her as he looked out at the city lights. They saw you with me. They will see you as a weakness, a lever to use against me. The implication was clear. She was a liability. The smart move, the only move, was for her to disappear. He could give her money, a new identity, send her anywhere in the world where she would be safe. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice quiet. He turned to face her. The exhaustion was back in his eyes, etched deeper now. "What I want stopped mattering a long time ago. Keeping my people safe is what matters. Keeping my territory secure. That is the job." "And me," she pressed. "Am I one of your people?" The silence stretched, thick with everything they had been through. He walked over to her, taking the whiskey glass from her hand and setting it aside. He took her hands in his. His were warm, calloused, the hands of a man who knew how to both build and destroy. "No," he said, his voice low and intense. "You are not one of my people." He paused, his thumb tracing a line over her knuckles. "You are my quiet, my stillness. In a life of noise and war, you are the only peace I have found." His gaze was a physical weight, a claim. "And they will not take that from me. I will not be too slow again." It was not a declaration of love.
It was a vow.
A statement of fact from a man who did not deal in hypotheticals.
A cost was paid for that night.
To ensure the Kenmatsu clan would never target her again, Takashi initiated a war. It was not loud or explosive, but a surgical, brutal dismantling of his rival's empire from the inside out. Men disappeared. Shipments were lost. Fortunes vanished overnight. He paid for her safety with the currency of his world, blood and fear. He shielded her from the details, but she saw the toll it took on him in the late hours they spent in his office, the silence between them now a comfortable, shared space. One evening, weeks later, after the last of the threat had been neutralized, she found him not in his office, but in the Zen garden. The moon was full, casting a silver light on the raked white gravel. He was standing by the koi pond, watching the colorful fish move like living jewels beneath the surface. She came to stand beside him. She was no longer in her uniform. She wore a simple black dress, one of several he had ordered for her, his quiet way of telling her she was no longer staff. She was something else. "It's over," he said, not looking at her. "You're safe. Are you?" she asked. He finally turned to her. A faint smile touched his lips, a rare, startling thing that transformed his face. In this life, safe is just the space between battles. She knew he was right. There would always be another rival, another threat. His world was not built for peace. But she was no longer the woman who polished his furniture, afraid of the shadows. She had walked through the fire with him and had not been burned. She had chosen to stay when she could have run. He reached out, his fingers gently tucking a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was certain. It was familiar. "I told you that you do not work here anymore," he said, his voice soft. "But I never asked what you wanted." She looked up at him, at this lethal, complicated man who had shown her his deepest wounds. She thought of the life she could have, a quiet, normal life far away from all this. Then she thought of the profound, unshakable sense of place she felt standing here, with him, in the moonlight. She was not a prisoner.
She was not a possession. She was a choice he had made, and he was a choice she was making right now.
"I want," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet night, "to be here when you get back from your battles." His hand moved from her hair to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. He did not say, "I love you."
He did not need to.
His eyes, dark and deep as the night sky, said everything. He acknowledged what she was to him, the anchor in his storm, the still point in his turning world. He leaned down and finally, after all the violence and all the silence, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of permanence, a seal on a silent contract. They stood there for a long time, under the Tokyo moon, surrounded by the perfect, fragile beauty of a garden built for peace and a life built for war. The silence between them was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a home,